Well, welcome back to CO 5701, and now we're switching to the TAN book, and we're going to look at secular theories of counseling and psychotherapy. Chapter 1 is not part of your assigned reading, but it does provide a good introduction to counseling theories. And Dr. Tan notes that counseling occurred long before Freud developed his theories, and he also lets us know there's like 400 theories in existence today. And he included a definition of counseling from Collins, whose books we've read in other classes. And he says the term psychotherapy and counseling are virtually the same thing. It's just different words being used. And on page 2, the definition he provides is that counseling is a trained person who practices the artful application of scientifically derived principles of establishing professional helping relationships with persons who seek assistance in resolving large or small psychological or relational problems. This is accomplished through ethically defined means and involves, in the broadest sense, some form of learning or human development. Kind of a long definition. So, scientifically derived refers to the fact that we don't want to just do anything in our counseling. We should use techniques that have been proven helpful. And most secular theories, they have to have a lot of research studies showing that they actually do help people before insurance will pay for their use. So this book covers what are known as the grand theories of counseling, the largest and perhaps earlier theories that have influenced some of the current models out there. So all of them will have some research showing their effectiveness. And as you'll see, we use some of the terms from these theories every day. And please note, all secular theories completely omit any reference to God. And they do this deliberately in order to make these theories applicable to everyone, whether you're a Christian or a Buddhist or whatever. A few theorists were actual atheists, like Freud. He definitely was even antagonistic towards religion. But they just don't mention it. And today we're seeing more research studies linking the connection between faith and religious practices with mental health, because there is a connection, of course. And if we have toxic faith, maybe where we believe God is after us or against us, that can affect our mental health, right? Just as having good practices and peace within us leads to better, I want to say sanity. Right? Faith and religion are part of every society, and we can't ignore them. So religion is just generally considered quite separate from most fields of study at a regular university. So anyways, if you get a chance, read Chapter 1. It might help you. I should have made it required reading, but I didn't this semester. Well, let's also look at the definition of a theory. A theory has 3 basic functions. It leads to observations that are verifiable through testable hypotheses. Actually, you make observations first, test some hypotheses, and at the end of that, with lots of research, you might develop your theory. Theories allows incorporation of empirical facts that are derived through research into a logically consistent framework. And a theory helps simplify observations by reducing irrelevant data. It's supposed to be a simple way of explaining observable phenomena. That's what a theory is supposed to do. Well, Tan continues in Chapter 1 by mentioning many different types of counseling practitioners, from psychiatrists to pastoral caregivers, and he even includes lay counselors. In fact, he wrote a book on the helpfulness of lay counseling himself, and he is a professor at Fuller Theological Seminary in California. All right, well, let's look at psychoanalytic theory. Many people have a lot of opinions about Sigmund Freud, but he was a pretty smart guy. As you can see on the slide, he mastered 7 languages. He practiced as a neurologist and published in that field. In addition to being a medical doctor, he's a psychiatrist. And I put a link to a Nova production on him. If you want to just hear him speak, it's just look at it for a moment if you feel like it. So he established psychoanalytic theory, and many of his fundamental ideas are still highly respected and referenced in our day. Well, in Freud's theories, not all of which have held the test of time, but he believed people were motivated by these unconscious instincts or drives towards pleasure, which he called life instincts, and that included sexuality, labeled eros or libido, and death instincts, also called thanatos, and that includes aggression in the death instincts. Those drive theories have kind of fallen out of favor. But his work on the unconscious is still widely accepted today. But he theorized that there is an unconscious part of us, part of our mind, and that's the largest part. We have sort of a pre-conscious, conscious, and a conscious part of our mental life that we're quite aware of. And these are all influential factors that affect personality and decision-making. So part of the purpose of psychoanalysis then was to bring some of these unconscious underlying ideas and beliefs to light where they could be worked on or examined, and then a person would have more freedom to choose what they need to do to reach their goals. Well, Freud also theorized that there are 3 structural elements within the human personality. We have the id, which is sort of the instinctual drive or physical urges. We have the superego, which is our moral code or social conscience, some people call it, and the ego, which is our conscious decision-making aspect of our personality. So I'm sure you've heard those terms before. We use terms like ego every day. And anxiety is part of every human being's life. And Freud categorized different kinds of anxiety. And he noted that in the face of anxiety, we often resort to using defensive mechanisms, most of which are poor reactions to an anxiety-provoking situation. So read through these. We use them all the time. Freud's sexual developmental theory has fallen from favor because, again, it's based on sex, and his, like, Oedipus complex and stuff like that kind of fallen out of favor. Later advancements on his theory focused more on the ego rather than the unconscious, and included work by his daughter Anna Freud. Well, Freud himself worked 18 hours a day. He wrote, he saw clients. He eventually died from cancer because he smoked tons of cigars every single day and developed cancer in the bone in his jaw. And after many, many operations, he died, and it's believed it was physician-assisted suicide. So even when he was in pain, he was quite productive. Well, some of the other things that he wrote about was the fact that most of the personality is formed by the time we're age 6. Not everyone agrees with that, but if you think about it, a lot of it is present in small children. He used, of course, dream analysis, interpretation. He underwent 3 years of analysis himself. Besides Oedipus complex, I'm sure you've heard the term Freudian slips, where you say one word when you meant another, and that can indicate something in your subconscious or somewhere, some conflict, some struggle, something that could be analyzed. Freud did use hypnosis some. In those days, you would, of course, be lying on the couch, the analyst is standing behind you, and they act as a neutral figure for the client. They're sitting out of view. the analyst doesn't self-disclose or offer any information about himself. And the client will then use free association, which is kind of saying whatever comes to mind, while the analyst is listening intently and making notes that will later be interpreted. So, of course, Freudian slips are important. Dream analysis was used, and it was called the talking cure. They also would analyze transference, and transference would be perhaps a person's talking about something and then they become angry at the analyst because they're sort of projecting feelings from other relationships onto the analyst, who is that sort of unknown neutral figure. And when you did that, the analyst could understand a bit more about relationships and their reactions. Of course, they considered how the patient was using defense mechanisms, and they called the client a patient because it was like a medical view. And they also analyzed resistance, because perhaps when someone's working on a hot topic, they would miss an appointment or come late or make excuses, because that's indication that it's a very important topic and perhaps quite threatening for the client to work on. And he did a lot of theorizing about something called seduction theory, which today, we do understand that sexual abuse in childhood has long-term effects. So he was one of the first persons, I guess, to, write a systematic approach to understanding that, its impact on mental health. Well, here's a list of some of the books that Freud's written. I can't say I've read a lot of them. I've read one or two, but he was a prolific author. And you can find his books still available on Amazon for sale. Well, Tan offers a biblical perspective of this theory. So how helpful is this theory to the biblical counselor? It's helpful to understand where the term ego comes from today, although perhaps we don't use it with the same meaning that Freud attributed to it. And we ought to know a bit about what the secular world understands about people. But for a biblical counselor, is understanding the unconscious helpful? What do you think about defense mechanisms? And please realize this one chapter is a brief overview of this theory. Do you see any parallels between the ego, id, and superego in a biblical model of man? Some have equated this model with the ego being our personality or soul, while the superego is the Holy Spirit and our conscience, and the id is our sin nature. But do note that it was a pretty pessimistic and negative view of humans that Freud held, but he ignored grace and redemption, which we find in the Bible. Freud was an atheist and was antagonistic to religion. So, is examining the self biblical? The Bible does say the heart is deceitful above all things and beyond cure. Who can understand it? There are, of course, limits to the sexual and aggressive drives proposed by Freud, and he does ignore other potential motivations of human beings, such as altruism. There are some other problems with establishing this theory in the research literature. There are many case studies showing how it works, but since it's such an individual process with each person, it's hard to make a group of clients and say this psychoanalytic technique was effective, at least on the early Freudian approaches. So would we say it's scientific? Would we say it's effective? It's been around for a long time. However, long-term analysis, which takes a couple years, is just too cost prohibitive for most people, and managed care insurance is not going to pay for someone to be psychoanalyzed. So there's only a few people who would be purely psychoanalytic practitioners. If we examined all of the United States, for example, a small percentage. Most secular counselors draw on aspects that they might find helpful from each theory. So, is it important to understand a bit about, if someone was sexually abused in childhood? I would say yes. So, is it important to understand what dreams mean? Some people say yes, some people say no. We have dreams in the Bible that seem to be important, so perhaps we can't dismiss them. Again, most secular therapists are, they just draw a bit from each theory. Few stick to one theory exclusively. And that's something to think about in your analysis. Well, let's move on to Adlerian theory. But before I do, Carl Jung was a part of the psychoanalytic school. He separated from Freud due to disagreements about the theories they developed. And he is a huge influence. There's a chapter on him in this book. Since we have limited time, we just can't touch on all the theories. But read that for yourself if you would be interested in exploring more about his work. Many Christians like him because he does include spirituality, but you couldn't say it was a specifically Christian spirituality. But he's the one who used the term complexes. You might have heard of collective consciousness or archetypes, and the terms persona, psyche, anima, and shadow come from his work. He was also a prolific author. And if you've ever taken the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, it's based on his theories. And he's got a lot of interesting reading. Well, Alfred Adler developed something called individual psychology, also known as Adlerian psychology. He was a world-renowned philosopher and psychiatrist, and he stressed the need to understand individuals within their social context. During the early 1900s, he began addressing such crucial and contemporary issues as equality, parent education, the influence of birth order, lifestyle, and holism of individuals. Adler believed we all have one basic desire and goal, which is to belong and to feel significant. Adler was Jewish, but he converted to Protestantism as an adult. He said nothing about his religious beliefs, and that left everyone wondering how much it meant to him or how it might have meshed with his theories. His theories influenced many others that were developed after his, but like Freud's approaches, there's little experimental research, but lots of case studies on his techniques. According to Adler, when we feel encouraged, we feel capable and appreciated, and will generally act in a connected and cooperative way. But when we're discouraged, we may act in unhealthy ways by competing, withdrawing, or giving up. So it's in finding ways of expressing and accepting encouragement, respect, and social interest that help us feel fulfilled and optimistic. Adler was part of Freud's original Vienna Psychoanalytic Society, but he broke away in 1911 to develop his own theories. He had a medical degree and practiced as an ophthalmologist, and later moved into the fields of neurology and psychiatry. And his marriage to a Russian feminist in 1897 is believed to have influenced the development of his theories. In addition, he served as a medical officer in World War I. He also established 30 child guidance clinics, advocated for school reforms, and wrote about child-rearing practices. His book, Understanding Human Nature, was a bestseller. Adlerian theory and practice have proven especially productive as it is applied to the growth and development of children. Adlerians believe that a misbehaving child is a discouraged child, and that helping children feel valued, significant, and competent is often the most effective strategy in coping with difficult child behaviors. Well, on the screen you'll see the information collected by an Adlerian therapist. They conduct an objective interview, a subjective interview. They're going to look at birth order and family constellation, how families connected. They're going to look at early recollections or memories and ask about dreams. And they see that dreams as a way of trying to deal with the present or the future. And there are 5 life tasks in this model. And I think we would agree with all of them that we want friendships, we want to be able to relate closely to others, we want to do meaningful work or make a contribution to society that matters. We want intimate love and family relationships, and ultimately we want to be able to accept ourselves, including our gender role. And spirituality is an important aspect of human life as well. And Adlerians are concerned with understanding unique and private beliefs and strategies, which they call a lifestyle, that each individual creates. And they believe this is started in childhood. This cognitive schema, or pattern of beliefs and lifestyle, serve as the individual's reference for attitudes, behaviors, and the private view of self, others, and the world. So when we look at our early life experiences and examine patterns of behavior, we see that they tend to repeat themselves in our lives, and they guide the methods that we choose to go about trying to gain significance and belonging. We might call this theory a teleo-socioanalytic theory, which is quite a mouthful. The teleo has to do with goal-directed behavior. The social has to do with social interest and belongingness, and analytic means we're examining motives or purposes. The person can only be understood as a whole. I think that's true. I would agree with Adler. So we do look at family constellations, and that means how do they relate to dad? How was your relationship with your mother, sisters and brothers? A lot of conflict, abuse, what was going on? And I think it's fair to say we might ask that as a biblical counselor. We might ask people about their chosen path in life and see if those are based on realistic beliefs or some fictions and the goals that they have for their life. Fictional finalism is what the term they use to describe a distorted view of the self and of the world. Well, during counseling, there are 4 phases. In the beginning, of course, is forming a relationship. We want to make that therapeutic connection if we're biblical counseling or if you're an Adlerian. So we want to show interest, good eye contact, make sure we describe informed consent, and we're listening for their story. The phase 2 is the psychological investigation, and in Exchange Life model we would call that the assessment phase. So they're going to assess the lifestyle of this person, the client, and listen for meaning and try to understand what's going on underneath what they're telling us. In the 3rd phase, they call psychological disclosure or interpretation, where we're trying to provide insights to the client. So in this process, the therapist would make tentative suggestions. Could it be that your history of abuse has led you to not trust men, or something like that? They would try to provide insights and suggest hypotheses to see which resonate with the client. And then during the last phase, which is called reorientation or re-education, the client is going to be helped to reframe old experience patterns and messages more accurately, ideally to create new experiences that are more positive or help them towards their goals, help them solve the problem that they brought to counseling. Well, some of the techniques are listed in your book starting on page 69, and they include things like encouragement, since that's a big part of this theory, addressing immediacy, which are the things going on between the client and the counselor in the moment, asking the question, which is, tell me what your life would be like if you woke up in the morning and this problem was gone. What would be different? You can imagine that helps people look at goals and examine what they're hoping for. You can ask clients to act as if, to say, tell me what you would do as if you were brave enough to stand up and say what you really thought in that situation. Act as if that was true and tell me what your response would be. We're encouraging them to rehearse good behaviors or healthier behaviors. Catching oneself had to do with helping the client recognize signals or triggers that lead them right into the problem behavior pattern of behavior they tend to fall into. Spitting in the client's soup is spoiling their game and helps people recognize maybe what they say they want isn't matching up with what they're doing. Avoiding the tar baby is acting contrary to what the client expects. Perhaps they always tell the sob story and they get all the sympathy, but you don't give them the sympathy. You ask something a little different. It's a surprise reaction. They may cause them to reevaluate the way they relate to others. There's a push button technique, sort of like the question. If you push the button and your problem went away, what would be different? Paradoxical intention is like asking the client to exaggerate the behavior. Like maybe they're worried when they're around people that they sweat too much. So you ask them, all right now I want you to sweat as hard as you can and show me how bad it would be. Anyways, it helps them kind of laugh about it, and then maybe they find relief when they see their fears are really exaggerated. And then there's interpretation, which is usually phrased tentatively, as I said before. You suggest, could it be that, or I have a guess that, if you did this, blah, 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 it was related to that. Not pronounced on the person, but suggested. So there's task setting, asking for commitment. There's homework in this model, the active phase of counseling, and then terminating involves summarizing the interview. So what makes counseling successful? And this is sort of an aside from adlerian therapy, but it's believed, and they've studied this a lot in research, that stuff that happens to the client outside of therapy accounts for 40% of the success. The therapeutic relationship itself counts for 30% of the success. See how important that is? Hope and expectancy, they're going to see a therapist, they're going to get better, counts for 15% of success. And the theoretical basis and the techniques you use only count for 15% of success. So just keep that in mind, how important that relationship is, how important that they feel hope and confidence in you that you're leading them towards success. I just thought I would share that with you. Rudolf Dreigers continued with Adlerian therapy after Adler's death and worked with children and continued working on the topic of the inferiority complex being part of the root issue of why people have problems. Okay, well, what are some of the disadvantages of this theory? Sometimes the assessment process is heavy. There's a lot of information collected about family history. Sometimes interpretations are very difficult to do well. Adlerian therapy works best with highly verbal and intelligent clients, so that might leave out many people who wouldn't benefit from this particular mode of therapy. And it might be too lengthy for most managed care. Insurance companies tend to authorize about 10 sessions at a time. And Adlerians, they don't diagnose people, they feel it labels people, and so that can be a problem with using your insurance to pay for it. They tend to see people who are as discouraged and in need of encouragement to seek a healthier course of action. Right, now, from a biblical perspective, this theory is definitely more optimistic and less deterministic compared to Freudian's. There's more potential for change and growth in this model. Identifying mistaken goals and mistaken thinking, we would say that's biblical. Social interests and community feelings are also biblical. Using encouragement doesn't conflict with the Bible either. Reorientation and re-education, we could say it's in line with taking steps of faith, doing appropriate works of obedience. And of course, God is missing from the picture in the Adlerian therapy, but they do at least mention that spirituality is important. Some of the problems that might conflict with the biblical perspective is that spiritual dimension is quite vague. Change can be somewhat superficial in this model when we ignore Christ. A subjective view of reality might contrast with the objective view of truth per Christianity. Inferiority feelings and striving for superiority can become prideful and selfish solutions to a problem. And also, it has had a great impact in the field of counseling, and many of his ideas have been absorbed into other theories, but there really isn't enough research on this model. Again, it's very broad. A lot of case studies are in the research, and perhaps it's so designed for individuals that's hard to study a group of 30 people using Adlerian techniques compared to 30 people getting psychoanalyzed. It'd be difficult to do it since it tends to be a longer term therapy. Well, I'm going to end right here for now, and I look forward to your take on these two models in discussion board this week. In your notes, I have sort of described a brief overview of some of the important principles we need to understand in biblical counseling, particularly exchange life counseling, because I realize this is the first course some people might take when they're entering the Masters of Biblical Counseling program. Well, thank you for your attention, and I pray you all have a very safe and very blessed week.